Hello everyone, I'm Jamie and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to show you how I made this modern looking dining table and benches on Jamie Makes It. I decided to try these pine furniture boards from B&Q. The ones I chose were clear pine, so there were no knots. The table length was just shy of 1.2 metres, which meant I could buy a 2.4 metre length, and as long as I didn't mess up, I could just cut one in half rather than buying an extra one. I bought another 2.4 metre length for the bench tops and a 1.2 metre one to make up the width of the table. I also bought some planed whitewood timber from B&Q to use for the aprons and legs. Once I got them back to the workshop, I measured, made a mark and then cross-cut the 2.4 metre boards in half using my circular saw and put these pieces to one side. I then set up a stop block at the miter saw and cut all the aprons and legs down to rough length. I labelled up each group of pieces for reference, which helps a lot. I took all the pieces into the house and left them there for the next week or so to acclimatise to a warmer environment, but I don't have any footage of this, sorry. My thinking for doing this was to allow the wood to expand and contract before I cut it down to final length and to minimise this happening in the client's house after being built. Once I got the pieces back in the workshop, my first point of call was to get the table cut to final width and glued up. These boards measured 300mm wide, so I ripped 100mm from one of the boards using my circular saw, guided by a surprisingly straight piece of timber. I placed a 100mm piece in between the two 300mm pieces and marked up where I wanted these three boards to join. I then took out the customary Festool domino. Okay, joking aside, I made this dowling jig using an offcut. I drilled a couple of 6mm holes centred in the side wall and marked a line on the top using a nail, which was centred on the holes I had drilled. Because the dowling jig was the same thickness as the pieces I was drilling into, I could get fairly accurate results as long as I used the pencil marks on the piece for the reference. Drilled 6mm holes with the help of the jig. And this turned out surprisingly really well. The boards were a really tight fit when doing a dry fit, or rather too tight if I dare say. There was a slight lip in between the middle piece and the two outer edges when I ran my hand over it, but it was something I would be able to sand out later. With that in mind, I proceeded with the glue up. I spread a bead of glue along the edge of the middle piece and into the dowel holes, making sure I had coverage all along the side. I put a bit of glue on the dowels and clamped up the tabletop. This is my second dining table and I should really get more long clamps. The widest place I could place this to dry was on top of my table saw. A wider workbench will be a future project. And here you can see there is a slight lip between the pieces. With the top drying up, I cut the aprons and legs down to final length at the miter saw. To connect the two leg parts together, I used dowels as well because I didn't want any visible fasteners. I used my workbench as an edge, clamped the two pieces together and marked where I wanted the dowels to go. So one of the issues I'm having here is these are 30mm dowels. These are 16mm thick. So I don't want to drill the same depth that I would say on the tabletop, because if if I go out slightly, I'm going to go straight through, a bit like I did with that one. So I just need to back off 5mm. Yeah, so I'm only going through about 10mm into the piece, yeah. And then I'll have to remember to reset it for the other piece so it can go all the way in. Yeah, that should work. With the offset established, I drilled and dry fit each leg to check the joint lined up nicely. With that set, I took the legs back apart, then glued and clamped each leg back together and allowed to dry. Need a cloth. I always need a cloth. I never learn. Once the legs are dried, I sanded the joints smooth using the benchtop sander. I also broke all of the sharp edges by hand, sanding with 100 grit. For the aprons, I lined up the pieces and made marks where I wanted the dowels to go. I also made marks on each piece where I wanted the pocket holes to go. I then drilled each hole for the dowels and also the pocket holes. Before gluing the aprons up, I decided to sand everything, and by heck did I sand. Despite everything being plain to smooth from the shop, I still sanded the legs and aprons from 120 to 240 grit and breaking the edges, making everything nice to the touch. For the table, I started as low as 60 grit to blend in the slight alignment issue. I also had a couple of gaps which I fixed, mixing some sawdust from the build with wood glue and rubbed into the gaps. With that drying, I trimmed one end of the table flush and then cut the other down to a size of just less than 120 centimeters. I also cut the bench tops down to their final length of 105 centimeters. I finished sanding the table and bench tops by working my way up to 240 grit and also broke the sharp edges by hand. After sanding, I then glued up the table and bench aprons. Before painting, I did a final dry fit of everything. I brought all the pieces into the house because the largest flat surface I had was our dining table. I bet neither I or my wife would have guessed our dining table would become an assembly table. I flipped the tabletop upside down, measured an equal distance at each end and each side, and attached the aprons to it using 1-inch pocket screws. To attach the legs to the aprons, I drilled holes and attached using 25mm screws. To the eagle-eyed viewers of you, I attached the legs on the inside of the aprons by mistake and had to reattach these on the outside afterwards. Naturally, the holes didn't line up, so I had to fill and sand these off camera. An extra couple of steps I shouldn't have had to do. With everything assembled, everything looked good. I'm quite impressed with myself. So I took it apart one last time, ready for finish. I wiped everything down with a slightly damp cloth to remove all the dust. I applied a generous amount of mineral oil to the tabletop using a kitchen paper towel, allowing it to soak in for about 15 minutes. I then wiped away the excess. I decided to apply the same finish to the bench tops as well. For the legs and aprons, I used a zinc vintage chalk paint from Grand Illusions. I applied 2 coats with a roller, allowing time to dry and sand in between coats with 400 grit. To protect the paint, I applied 2 coats of Rust-Oleum lacquer with a smooth roller. This gave the bases a simple satin finish. I applied 2 coats, allowing time to dry in between coats. Once dried, I took the table and benches around to the client's house to install. Now I didn't have time to do a final assembly before taking it to the client's house, so the finished result was also a surprise to me as well as the client, and I gotta say I was proper happy with how it turned out. The colour of the legs in contrast to the top and the long straight lines give this table and benches a real modern look. This was a really enjoyable build. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and I would proper appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. See you in the next video.